For years, I thought silence was the safest way to love my family. Every time they talked over me, every decision made without me, I told myself it was fine, that one day, they'd see who I really was. But they never did. They didn't even try. When my father looked at me across the table that night and said, "You get nothing," something inside me went very still. Not broken, just finished. Because I realized it wasn't disappointment I felt anymore. It was clarity. I had spent my whole life believing fairness was something you earned. That if you worked hard, stayed kind, stayed quiet, people would notice. They didn't, and now they will. They just don't know yet what I've been keeping quiet about all this time. I never knew applause could sound that cold. It echoed through the old Hale house, bouncing off oak-paneled walls and half-empty wine glasses. My father, Richard Hale, stood beneath the chandelier, his voice smooth and final as he read the last lines of the will. All assets, all land, all authority, handed to my brother, Evan Hale. Then he paused, a small, deliberate silence. As for Veronica, she will receive no portion of the estate. The words landed like frost. Then came the clinking of crystal, polite laughter, a few murmured congratulations. Evan lifted his glass as if the crown had finally touched his head. My mother lowered her gaze to the table, pretending to fix her napkin. She couldn't meet my eyes. I stayed still, hands folded on my lap. No protest, no gasp, just stillness, the kind of quiet that hides a storm. And then I smiled. It wasn't wide, not sharp, not sad, just a small curve that no one could read. The room kept buzzing, unaware that something irreversible had already shifted. Beside my father, his attorney, Mr. Banning, all polished charm and paperwork, cleared his throat, ready to move on to formalities. I tilted my head slightly, my voice calm but clear enough to cut through the noise. "Mr. Banning, you really don't know, do you?" The room froze. The glasses stopped midair. My father frowned. Evan's grin faltered, and even my mother looked up, eyes wide for the first time that evening. I held their gaze and felt it, the turn of the tide. They thought this was their ending. They had no idea it was only the beginning. If someone asked what it was like growing up in my house, I'd say it felt less like a home and more like a boardroom. Every dinner sounded like a shareholders' meeting, every word a verdict. My father believed strength left no room for softness, and his gaze, sharp and approving, belonged only to Evan. He was everything my father celebrated, loud, impulsive, magnetic. The perfect echo of him. I existed somewhere between their conversations, a quiet presence at the edge of their orbit. When I got accepted into law school at the University of Oregon, my father didn't even look up from his newspaper, said he was glad. At least I'd know when someone tried to cheat me on a contract. It was his way of being proud, disguised as a warning. I smiled, said nothing. I'd already learned that in this family, silence kept the peace better than honesty ever could. My mother, Judith, had the gentlest hands and the softest spine. She lived suspended between a husband who demanded control and a son who thrived on indulgence. Her love was real but quiet, the kind that tried to soothe damage without ever stopping it. I grew up in that in-between space, where affection was measured by convenience, not care. The only person who ever truly saw me was my grandmother, Eleanor Hale. She had once been the backbone of the company before her name was erased from its history books. The official version said my father built Hale timber from the ground up. The truth was, she had swung the first axe herself. In her later years, she moved to a small house near the Oregon coast, surrounded by the scent of sap and salt. Every weekend I visited her, carrying my laptop and files, pretending it was to help with her finances. She always knew better. One afternoon, as the waves murmured beyond the window, she asked if I knew why forests survived. I told her because they could grow back. She smiled, her eyes bright with something I didn't yet understand. Because sometimes, she said, to survive, the forest has to burn first. Back then, It sounded poetic. I didn't know it was a warning. It was a warm June afternoon when she called and asked me to come early. The ocean breeze carried through her window, and 2 cups of tea steamed on the table between us. In front of her sat a thick envelope stamped and sealed. "Veronica," she said, "if the day ever comes when you hear applause, but your heart feels heavy, open this." I hesitated, but she pushed the envelope toward me, her frail hand steady. Across the front, I read the words Eleanor Hale Environmental Trust. Inside were notarized documents, legal transfers granting me 40% of the company's shares and full stewardship over the protected forest lands. My grandmother's signature rested beside that of a woman named Harriet Lowe, the notary. I stared at her, speechless. Why me? Her smile was small but certain. Because you don't need power to feel worth something. That was the first time I saw tears in her eyes, though her voice never trembled. She told me how, years earlier, my father had forced her to transfer ownership for the sake of streamlined management. She'd agreed on paper, but not in spirit. Quietly, she had created this trust to preserve the forests and the values she feared would die with her. The trust was under my name. Only she and Harriet knew it existed. That night, before I left, she walked me to the door and rested her hand on mine. "When they forget who planted the first tree," she said, "remind them, not with words, but with paper." I didn't understand then that she wasn't talking about trees. She was talking about me. The rain hadn't stopped since the day we buried her. It came down soft and steady, the way Oregon always grieves. While everyone else spoke about my grandmother as a saint, a pioneer, a legacy, I only heard her last words in my mind. "Stay quiet. You'll know when to speak." 3 days later, my father called. His tone wasn't grief. It was business. 7 o'clock. Come home. The family needs to talk. Home was the same. Large, polished, soulless. The portraits of Hale men lined the wall, their oil-painted stairs all carrying the same pride. My grandmother's picture hung smaller than the rest, tucked into a corner like a footnote. My father sat at the head of the table, pen poised. Evan leaned against the fireplace, the smirk already in place. On the table was a single folder, Waiver of Inheritance. My father spoke as if I'd already agreed. "Just a formality. Evan will take care of things. You have your own life." I asked what would happen if I didn't sign. He didn't hesitate. "Then you'll make everything harder. Don't dishonor her memory." I read the lines carefully, each word another cut. My mother's hand trembled as she poured tea that no one drank. I folded the paper neatly, set it back down. "I'll review it first." Evan laughed. "What's there to review? You were never really part of this." That was the moment something shifted. That night, in my small apartment in Eugene, I opened my safe. The air smelled of metal and rain. Inside was the envelope my grandmother had given me years ago. The Eleanor Hale Environmental Trust. Her seal, her signature, 40% of the company, and every inch of her faith in me. I ran a hand over the papers, hearing her again. "Keep it. Use it when the truth is twisted." And I knew. The time she'd spoken of had come. 2 weeks later, my father showed up at my office without warning. He didn't sit. He didn't look around. He just stood there, towering, as if my walls were too small for his pride. "Stay out of this mess," he said. I asked which mess he meant, his or Evan's. His jaw tightened. "Don't use that tone with me. Everything I've done has been for this family." I told him families weren't built by control. He slammed his hand on my desk. "If you fight this, you'll regret it." When he left, the air smelled of wet cedar and warning. That night, I was still working when an email appeared. The sender, Clarice. She'd been Hale Timber's accountant before she quit. Her message was short. "Don't tell anyone. Just look." The attachment was a report from the Environmental Fund. Line after line of vague expenses, engagement trips, research travel, maintenance costs, all signed by Evan Hale. I sent it to Harriet Lowe. 30 minutes later, she called. Her voice was calm, but I heard the storm beneath it. I remember that fund. It was never meant for this. Veronica, this is embezzlement. I followed her instructions. Back up everything. Encrypt it. Make copies. Then wait. I stood at the window as rain streaked the glass, city lights trembling like fire underwater. I finally understood what my grandmother meant when she said the forest sometimes had to burn before it could grow back. They had taken her name, her honor, her work, and now I held the one thing they didn't, the truth. No one expected a celebration to feel like a trial waiting for a verdict. That was Evan Hale Day. My father orchestrated the event with his usual precision. Banners in gold, brass bands echoing through the courtyard, the company's flag rising against the gray Oregon sky. A slogan stretched across the building: Legacy continues. The invitations gleamed in gold foil. Family is the foundation of legacy. Join us in celebration. I knew better. It wasn't an invitation, it was a performance. A warning dressed in politeness. Come and watch someone else's victory. Don't interfere. I arrived wearing a simple navy suit, a small leather bag over my shoulder. Inside were the encrypted drive, Harriet's letter of verification, and a printed copy of the trust. I wasn't there to celebrate. I was there to witness. When I stepped into the grand lobby, conversations paused for a second, just long enough for eyes to skim over me before moving on. I'd become an accessory in my own family's portrait, background, not blood. My father smiled for the cameras, gripping my arm lightly as he spoke to reporters. This is my daughter, Veronica, a brilliant attorney. The Hale family couldn't be prouder. His tone was practiced, smooth, the kind of pride that photographs well. Evan took the stage soon after, lights flashing across his face. His voice rang through the speakers, confident, hollow. Hale Timber will carry forward my grandmother's vision, strength, leadership, and honor. The applause roared. I clapped once, slowly, then stopped, because the only words I heard weren't his. They were hers. You don't need to lead, Veronica. You just need to preserve. While the audience cheered, I pulled my phone from my pocket and quietly hit record. His speech, every boast, every lie about the environmental fund he'd been stealing from, would be preserved, too. When my father and brother raised their glasses for the cameras, I stepped into the hallway and sent the recording to Harriet. They just confessed without knowing it. I texted. Her reply came within seconds. Good. Stay quiet. The storm's forming. 3 days later, she forwarded me an email from the Oregon Bureau of Corporate Oversight. They'd officially opened an internal investigation into Hale Timber's financial conduct. Then came the call. Daniel Price, my former law student, now a compliance officer, spoke with the kind of caution that only comes when truth starts to take shape. If your evidence is correct, Hale Timber isn't just misusing funds, it's laundering money through that environmental trust. I asked him not to mention my name in any report. I didn't want recognition. I wanted justice. A few nights later, I found an anonymous message in my inbox. Stop digging, Veronica. You'll lose everything. I didn't need a signature. The capital T in stop gave him away. Evan always wrote them long, like daggers. I archived it, backed it up, and labeled it Evidence B. Holding the truth doesn't feel like victory. It feels like standing at the edge of a collapsing mountain. You know it's coming down, and you can't step away. I drove to Harriet's home that evening, the evidence box heavy on the passenger seat. When I set it on her desk, she studied me for a moment and said only, "You did the right thing. Now get ready. They won't fight you directly. They'll fight dirtier." I believed her, and I knew she was right. It didn't take long for her warning to become prophecy. 2 weeks later, my father called again. His voice was firm, rehearsed. "Come home. We need to talk." By the time I arrived, the rain had returned, tapping against the windows like a metronome of dread. My father sat by the fireplace with Banning, his attorney. A new stack of papers lay on the table. "Your grandmother was mistaken," he said. "We're re-establishing order." Banning adjusted his glasses. "This document nullifies any unauthorized claims of inheritance. All we need is your consent, Ms. Hale? I stared at the pages, each line a quiet act of betrayal. You're rewriting the will of a dead woman, I said. My father didn't flinch. I'm correcting it. You don't understand what family honor costs. I turned on my phone, recording the conversation without moving my hand. When Banning noticed, he lunged for it, but by then, the audio had already uploaded to the cloud. Justice doesn't belong to the loudest man in the room. I told them, it belongs to the one who came prepared. My father rose, face red, finger trembling. You're no longer part of this family. I walked toward the door, my voice calm. I never was. Father, but she left me something you can't erase. I left that house with nothing but my bag, my drive, and a chill that wouldn't leave my bones. That night, a knock came at my apartment door. My mother stood there, drenched in rain, her eyes swollen. In her trembling hand, she held a small metal key engraved with 2 letters. E.H. She made me keep this, my mother whispered. Said to give it to you when your father forgot who he used to be. I asked what it opened. She smiled sadly. Her safe. The one at the beach house. Before dawn, I drove through the storm to the coast. The old house stood quiet against the surf, its windows fogged with time. In the living room, behind a faded painting of waves, I found the safe. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a single cassette recorder and a folded note. If you're hearing this, they've already forgotten. But I haven't. I pressed play. My grandmother's voice filled the room, soft, hoarse, unbroken. 40% of Hale assets shall remain under Veronica Hale's stewardship. To protect, not to own. My throat tightened. She had seen this coming all along. Beneath the recorder lay another envelope, the notarized duplicate from Harriet, stamped and sealed, every page legal, every detail untouched. Proof that everything I'd been fighting for wasn't rebellion. It was restoration. I walked outside with the recorder in my hand. The storm had passed. The first sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the sea. For the first time in years, I let myself speak aloud. Now, Grandma, I said, they'll have to listen. Portland woke in fog that morning, thick, still, and cold. As I drove toward the Hale estate, I wasn't thinking about inheritance or revenge. Only her voice echoed in me. You don't need to speak loudly, only rightly. The house glowed with ceremony. Dozens filled the long dining room. Relatives, advisors, reporters. My father sat at the head, his smile rehearsed. Evan stood beside him, basking in attention. My mother stayed near the back, small and quiet. My father began. Evan Hale will inherit the company, the land, and the Hale legacy. Applause swelled. I didn't join. I opened my briefcase, placed a folder on the table, and said evenly, Mr. Banning, are you sure you have the correct version of the will? The lawyer hesitated. The room shifted. Then the door opened. Harriet Lowe entered, carrying a file and an old recorder. She pressed play. My grandmother's voice filled the air, steady and alive. 40% of Hale assets shall remain under Veronica Hale's stewardship, to protect, not to own. Evan shouted denial, but Harriet laid down the notarized pages. All verified, she said. My father's glass shattered against the floor. Justice, I told him silently, doesn't need your belief, only proof. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Harriet reached into her briefcase and pulled out another file. The financial records we had gathered for months. Her voice stayed calm as she laid the pages down. These statements show that over $2.4 million were withdrawn from the company's environmental fund in the last 2 years. Authorized by Evan Hale. Banning flipped through the papers, his complexion draining with every line. This is embezzlement. Mr. Hale! Evan's voice cracked. Dad! I did it for the company. My father's command came like a slap. Enough. Evan. Before another word, the doors opened. 2 men in black suits stepped inside. Badges raised. Oregon Bureau of Corporate Oversight. We're here under an emergency inspection order. A complaint and evidence were filed this morning. I met Harriet's eyes. She'd done it the moment the meeting began. Evan stumbled back, pale. Who did this? The truth doesn't need a hand, I said softly. It only needs room to exist. My father sank into his chair, head bowed. My mother placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. Richard, she whispered. She warned us, and we forgot why she started. No one spoke again. Only the recorder played on. My grandmother's voice steady through the silence. Family isn't who inherits, it's who protects. Evan was escorted out. My father murmured one broken line. We didn't know. That's the point, I told him. You never wanted to. No one won that day. The truth simply stood up and refused to move. 3 months later, the sign on the front gate read, Hale Foundation. The company was now a non-profit, dedicated to forest preservation. I hadn't destroyed my father's empire. I had simply returned it to what my grandmother intended. A place that protects, not possesses. My father retired quietly. Evan was barred from management. My mother moved back to the coast, replanting the fir trees once cut for profit. One evening by the Columbia River, my father found me watching the water. He looked smaller, softer. He said he'd learned inheritance wasn't about money. It was about conscience. No, I told him. It's about memory. Who we choose to remember, and who we choose not to become. Before leaving, he placed an envelope on the bench. Inside was an old photo. Him, my grandmother, and me beneath the same tree I'd replanted. On the back, he'd written, You reminded me who planted it first. That night, I returned to the beach house. The wind moved through young trees, waves whispering against the shore. I played her old recording once more. Truth doesn't raise its voice. I smiled, not for victory, but because justice had finally come home.